They say the most important thing a test pilot needs to do is describe what they are doing and what is happening, even as a plane disintegrates around them, so that maybe the next person can avoid the same fate. I managed to land this project, but only barely. It almost broke me several times. Turns out, multiplying every step by 1,000 has consequences. A bit over 2 years ago, I made the 2/3 keyboard. It was a fun project. It finally got me doing some 3D printing, and it was my first seriously popular video on this channel. But I didn't want to get pigeonholed as a keyboard guy, so I resisted the siren call to do another one just because I thought it could get a lot of views. But I also liked the idea of having a full trilogy of alternative typing videos, including the Pocket Typewriter project. I kept thinking about an old Tom Scott video about making a set of keyboards that can type emoji. It's an interesting video, really focusing on tools that are good for just getting stuff done when you need stuff to get done. But in the end, the project was just a bunch of normal keyboards plugged together. It wasn't a keyboard, not a single monolithic entity the way I kind of wish it had been. And that sounded like an interesting challenge, except I don't really love emoji. I mean, I use them, of course, but the aesthetics aren't really for me. So I waited to see if I came up with a really good or really terrible idea. And now I think I have. So the point of a keyboard is to enter one character of text at a time. But what if instead of one character, it entered an entire word? Think of the efficiency gained. One keystroke, one word of text. Simple, logical, beautiful. Unfortunately, the English language has a lot of words. Not, contrary to what some people think, an unusual amount, depending on how you count, but definitely a lot. If a keyboard is to follow one key equals one word, we're going to have to come up with a limited subset of words to work with. But how can we know if they're still able to fulfill the magic of natural language, the ability to describe any and all ideas? Well, by standing on the shoulders of giants, of course. In 2012, the XKCD comic Upgoer 5 was published, which described the workings of a Saturn V rocket using only the 1,000 most common English words. Or, as it would say, the 1,000 most common English words, since 1,000 is not, itself, included in the list. This was followed by a full book, Thing Explainer, which covers such diverse topics as nuclear reactors, plate tectonics, the US Constitution, and the USS Constitution. After the comic came out, there was a brief fad on LiveJournal. Yes, it was that long ago, of describing one's job or research this way. And it's really an interesting challenge, forcing you to confront complexity without hiding behind jargon. This is what I came up with at the time. I help people tell computers how to see how big things are. The computers do this by touching the things many times with a little stick all over. I also make sure that they tell the computers how to do this in the right way. It is important that the computers get the right answer for how big things are, so that things can be used in making other things. And this provides the perfect lexicon for our keyboard. It's big enough to be very silly indeed, but not impossibly big. And we know that a vast array of complicated topics can be discussed using it. I decided to use the list of words from the Upgoer 5 text editor, created by Theo Sanderson shortly after the original comic went live. Randall later put up his own tool, but his list was considerably longer than 1,000 entries, because it included lots of derived, inflected forms of the words, like having fail, fails, failing, and failure all as separate entries. This makes sense if you're checking in software to see if a word is valid or not. And while I was happy to follow Randall's lead and allow inflected forms, I couldn't have a separate physical key for each one. If you wanted to use an inflected form, you'd have to type it in with the help of a modifier key. So Theo's list it was. The choice of what list to use is a subtle point. This is an exercise in computational linguistics we're engaged in, and the choice of corpus is always central to that. A corpus is just a collection of language that can be analyzed for statistical patterns. Training data, in other words, and it has all the pitfalls you might associate with that term. It might be easiest to get, say, every New York Times article written over a 20-year period, but what linguistic biases does that imply? Patterns you discover in that corpus might not have much relevance to another field, such as spoken language. But unfortunately, generating a high-quality corpus of spoken language is much, much more expensive and messy. People don't often speak in complete sentences, much less paragraphs. I wouldn't be doing so myself right now if I wasn't working from a script. Should different pronunciations count as different words? What about I'm going to versus I'm gonna versus I'ma? Spoken language varies a lot more by both physical and temporal location, making it harder to gather and limiting its application. Until recently, the internet was providing a golden age of corpus generation, as a large fraction of all social interactions were happening via text, but that window is probably closing as the tsunamis of AI-generated slop wash over everything else. But computational linguistics can be more small-scale and personal than that. I came across this book, Verbal Behavior, Adaptation and Psychopathology in grad school, while looking for studies on how emotional state can influence language generation. I had a vague idea there could be an interesting tool for game developers, letting player actions determine not just what an NPC is willing to share with them, but how it would be phrased in the process. The idea never went anywhere, and recent developments have obsoleted it anyway, but at least I got a good class project out of it. This book applies some rather simplistic analysis to speech recorded from groups of people under psychiatric treatment. Remarkably, it applies these same tools to the transcripts of the Watergate tapes. Thanks to this, my text rendering tool for that class project was able to include sliders to specify how schizophrenic, delusional, depressive, compulsive, and Richard Nixon the speaker was supposed to be. Anyway, the problem with 1,000 is that it's kind of a liminal value. Big enough to be big, to be sure, but still kind of small compared to the really big numbers. A keyboard with 500,000 keys? Obviously impossible. A keyboard with 1,000? Sure, maybe. Let's set some basic parameters. How big would this thing be? I arbitrarily decided to aim for it to fit on my full desk, meaning it could be up to 5 feet wide and about 18 inches deep. That's far too wide for a single PCB, so it would have to be divided into panels. 5 was the obvious choice here, since that's the minimum order most places. The words would be arranged alphabetically, following the panels, so each one would be like a separate page in a dictionary to aid navigation. The keycap color would also alternate by letter to help a bit. I wanted to use standard switches and keycaps, but how wide should the keycaps be? Lots of words are too wide to fit on a single unit keycap after all. Ideally, each keycap would be as wide as needed to fit the word printed on it. That would look so cool, while also introducing some annoying justification issues. But it would mean that each PCB in the keyboard would have a unique layout determined by whatever words would end up being on that panel. That's a lot of room for a silly mistake to get baked in early on. And also, we're talking about half a square meter of circuit board here. Doing a run of 5 duplicates was already going to be expensive enough. Doing 5 runs of unique boards at 5 times the cost just wasn't going to be an option. Some experimentation convinced me that 1.25 unit keycaps, about 1 inch wide each, would be wide enough to fit all the words well enough. Some would have to be hyphenated, but the distribution gets pretty Zipfian after 4 characters, so there weren't too many of those. This meant that every panel could be 12 columns wide by 17 rows deep. That would more or less fit within the space constraints and provide a total of 1,020 keys. 1,000 for the words and 20 for utility keys like enter and escape that would be required to claim that this was actually a functional keyboard. The circuits wouldn't be complicated, just big. I talked about the switch matrix circuit in the 2/3 video, including details about why each switch needs a diode, so I refer you to that if you're interested. This was the exact same thing, just 11 times bigger. But I wanted it to be a keyboard. A keyboard, not 5 keyboards in a trench coat. That means it needs a single switch matrix spanning the entire thing so that a single microcontroller can run it. A matrix 17 rows tall by 60 columns wide, requiring a whopping 77 I/O lines to run. Not a super efficient layout, but even the maximally efficient 31 by 32 matrix would still require 63 I/O lines to run, so it didn't seem worth fighting. This is just a ridiculously large keyboard, and chasing optimization isn't going to change that. The space constraints made the PCB layout really interesting. I could certainly daisy-chain the panels together, but my first attempts at this wasted far too much space routing all the switch matrix lines at the top. After several revisions, I managed to get them all running in between the switches, so no space was wasted. Another interesting challenge was the column lines. Now, the 17 row lines, those could pass through from board to board without problem. But of the 60 column lines, each board would only need access to 12. But which 12? And how to make that design work when it's the same design shared for all of the 5 panels? I solved this with solder jumpers. These are pads on the PCB which aren't meant for a component to be attached to. Instead, you just solder over the ones you want closed, bridging the gap between the pads to complete the connection. There is also a similar inverse technique, which leaves sections of trace designed to be cut with a utility knife so you can break connections. For each column on each PCB, there are 5 separate lines that could be relevant. For the first column, these would be lines 0, 12, 24, 36, and 48. All of these are routed up to the top of the board into a series of solder jumpers, and only the one that is soldered closed is actually connected to the switch column. On the first board, all the number 1 jumpers have been soldered closed, all the number 2 jumpers on the second board, and so on. This means that line 0 will be connected to the first column on the first board, line 12 to the first column on the second board, and so on yet again. Finally, the keyboard would need some brains. It's not actually hard to write keyboard control software, you just have to make sure the microcontroller can directly mimic a USB keyboard. I chose the Arduino Micro based mostly on its size. But, you might be objecting, that only has 24 digital I/O lines. How could it possibly control a 77-line switch matrix? With port expanders, dear friends. There are several options, but I went with the MCP23017 because it seems so well supported. I first tested it with a couple cheap dev boards, and it ended up being pretty easy. The Arduino can talk to up to 8 of them over I2C, and they each provide 16 lines of digital I/O. There are 3 address lines on the chips, and by grounding those you can assign addresses so they don't get confused with each other. On the dev boards this is done with a solder pad technique like above, but on the final control boards it was just going to be part of the circuit. With the concept proved, it was pretty simple to come up with a control board, with 5 MCP23017s providing a total of 80 lines of I/O. I could have gotten away with only using 4, but I figured at this point it was better to keep all of the I/O access working in the same way, instead of some coming in over native Arduino ports and some coming in over I2C. Plus, since the control board is a completely separate unit from the switch matrix panels, I figured I might as well make it as generally useful as possible. You never know when something like that might come in handy. The boards, while challenging in places, were never going to be a problem. I've made lots of PCBs before. I've even made a giant keyboard PCB before. No, what kept me up at night were the keycaps. How was I going to make 1020 custom keycaps without suffering psychic damage in the process? Well, there were a couple options. I could 3D print them, the way I did with the 2/3 keyboard. With some epoxy putty rubbed into the debossed letters, they were high contrast and quite good looking, I think. Except it took me a solid month of work to get the 86 I needed then. I could do that faster now, since that included ramping up with resin printing to begin with, but it would still mean multiple months of work repeating something I've already done. And while they looked pretty, they were a bit more fragile than I would like. People can get kind of violent with weird keyboards, I've since witnessed. And a 1.5 meter long keyboard is liable to suffer some big bangs just moving it around, so 3D printing didn't seem like the best option. I could buy blank keycaps and make them with a laser, either engraving into the surface or marking them some other way. This was a very tempting option, particularly after seeing some videos of people using lasers to adhere printer toner or powder coating powder. It would be easy enough to make a jig holding a couple dozen keycaps mounted in the bed of the engraver. You could crank through those as fast as you could put together the vector files to be engraved, but unfortunately, I don't have a laser, and this channel isn't to the point yet where people start sending me that kind of stuff. I certainly do want one, hint hint, but this project was already looking to be expensive enough as it was. Reluctantly, I put this option aside. That left printing onto blank keycaps using die-sub transfer sheets. This is one of the ways that commercial keycaps are made, so I knew it could work in theory. Die-sub printing is when the ink sublimates, going directly from a solid to a gas. The ink can be printed onto transfer sheets, using a special cartridge in just a normal inkjet printer. You then press the transfer sheet with a lot of heat against the thing you want printed, and the ink just makes the jump over. The attractive thing about this is that people do it at home all the time, usually for t-shirts or hats or mugs, but it's a cheap commodity tech. To see if it could work, I got some example transfer sheets printed and started playing around with an iron. Like most keycaps, the ones I wanted to work with aren't flat on top, they're concave. An iron can't reach down in there, so it would need some kind of firm but squishy pad to transfer the heat and pressure down onto the keycap surface. Since it would be exposed to so much heat, the obvious choice here was silicone. For the first experiments, I cast a silicone sleeve directly around a keycap, which would then be popped out after it's set. This had the added benefit of providing some basic registration for the die-sub transfer sheet. I could cut those out, nestle them down into the silicone sleeve, and then put the keycap on top of that. The whole thing is turned over and the iron applied. Early results were not entirely encouraging, but I kept experimenting and was eventually getting some decent results. The silicone pad had to be very thin, and it took a lot more heat and pressure than I was originally expecting. But the concept was proved, so it was time to start thinking about how to scale this up. Doing this one by one was certainly not going to be acceptable. Like I said, heat presses are commodity craft store supplies now, so I could find a used one for $75. It was covered in parakeet feathers and smelled accordingly, but still a good deal. I had an idea that I could 3D print a jig to hold 15 to 20 keycaps at a time. The jig would provide registration for both the die-sub transfer sheet and the silicone pad. The silicone pad would be pretty much the same thing as before, just cast in a 3D printed mold, with a separate bump for each of the keycaps being printed. Easy, right? Yeah, no, the project kind of ground to a halt at this point because I was ignorant of a very important fact. Resin prints can inhibit silicone curing. I kept getting goopy messes and thinking I had messed up the ratio or the mixing step. After finally figuring out that this was in fact a thing, I tried some clear coat on the mold to try and lock in whatever the gooifying chemicals were. Didn't help. So then I thought maybe I could use something else. I could 3D print a mold, cast some other, more silicone-friendly material in that to make the mold, and then cast the silicone sheet in that. What about alginate? That stuff is cheap. Well, it was certainly cheap, but also kind of useless. I had forgotten that alginate molds are always used almost immediately because they start to dry out and shrivel quickly. They're also always just kind of moist until they dry out and are ruined. I couldn't get silicone to cast in it reliably, so I dropped the idea. What about other silicones? I tried one that people said played nicely with resin prints, and it did. But it was so viscous that I couldn't get a consistent thickness, so that wasn't going to work. I tried using it in the mold, which worked okay, but then it turned out my old silicone didn't like it either, and I was back where I started. Finally, I found a low viscosity 10-cure silicone, which worked in the 3D prints and was fluid enough to self-level before curing. Whew! This meant I could finally get back to the thing I was trying to do, print keycaps. And that meant another round of experimentation, figuring out if and exactly how the key jig idea was going to work. The recipe I finally settled on was a jig holding 16 keycaps, designed around the smallest circular heat pad that came with the press. Scale the pads in the 3D printed mold to be twice as deep as the actual concavities. The profile of the curve I took directly from the same DSA keycap models I was using when 3D printing them for the 2/3. Cast the silicone pad in the mold with 25 plus 2.5 grams of AB silicone mix. This doesn't look like it is enough, but it will self-level before curing and result in a very thin but consistent pad. Always fill all the slots in the key jig. Early on I was only trying a few keys at a time to not burn through keycaps too quickly, and the ones on the edges were having serious registration issues, with the text millimeters away from where it should be. This is why I left the keycap outlines for this period of testing, to let me directly see the misalignment. I figured the paper was being forced down into the concavities of each keycap, stretching it. I was thinking I would have to figure out through slow and expensive trial and error the exact offset needed for each key to prevent this misalignment, and I was kind of dreading it. But then I happened to try a run with all the key slots filled and the problem more or less went away. It turned out it was the paper sagging in the middle over the missing keycaps that was causing most of the problem. Set the heat press for 230 C, running for 4 minutes. Rotate the entire pack 3 times during this period to make sure the keys on the edge get printed clearly. The duration can be reduced some if you're doing a bunch of runs in a row as the jig warms up. I've also had to reduce the temperature over time for reasons I don't really understand. Maybe I've burned out some padding inside the heat press or something so heat transfer is faster, but it's now a lot easier to melt the edges of keycaps than it was at the beginning. There were also registration issues caused by rotating the pack. Each time you open the press, the transfer sheet can get jostled around. The last major improvement was to reprint the jig, adding little shelves for the paper to rest on, with slots so alligator clips could hold it in place firmly. There were still some problems. Keycaps printing too light or so dark there was bleeding, multiple prints where the transfer sheet still managed to shift around some, and the keycaps with melted edges. But it was infrequent enough I was willing to accept the inevitable reprints. So I started cranking them out, by this point exiled with my stinky, smoky heat press to the shop. I made a couple more improvements to the process at this point, when faced with the reality of 64 cycles to run, not including reprints at the end. I printed a second jig, so I could be loading one while the other was baking. And I added holes in the jig behind each keycap so they could be popped out from behind. They're quite hot coming out of the press. The less direct contact with fingers, the better. A simple print with a bunch of rods sticking up means they can all get popped off quickly and easily. And as a bit of last-minute flair, I decided the utility keys would be in a nicely contrasting red, to make them stand out a bit from the 1000 word keys. With the keycaps mostly printed, it was time to send the PCBs off to be fabbed. And I'm happy to say, this service was provided by PCBWay as support for the channel. Submitting the job was made simple with their KiCad plugin. Seriously, I had never used it before, and it just worked. Click the green button and your entire current project is uploaded to PCBWay. This will even handle component information if you want to use their assembly service. They were gracious enough to provide that for this project as well, and I was pretty excited about it as I had never had a board assembled before. To make it work, I just needed to add these fields to the relevant components in the schematic editor, update on the PCB side, and send it off via the plugin. And here are the results I got back 15 days later for a very Merry Christmas. This is an objectively ridiculous design, and they did a great job on them. Look, I wasn't joking about them covering a full half of a square meter. And I was thrilled to see all the diodes assembled out of the box. That was going to be a lot of very tedious work, and even paying out of pocket the assembly service would have been absolutely worth it. Thanks, PCBWay. It was at this point, with the end of the project seemingly in sight, that I realized I had made a very silly mistake. See, the code was going to need not just a list of 1000 words, but a matrix of up to 10 different inflections for each of those words, depending on which modifier key was being held down. Noun, verb, adjective, adverb, plural, possessive, gerund, past tense, actor or intensifier, and superlative. A lot of these could be procedurally generated, such as adding a trailing s for plural, but English? She ain't that regular. A lot were going to have to be explicitly listed. It would still be a sparse matrix, mathematically speaking, but not that sparse. I started to worry it wouldn't fit on the micro. I spent a few days putting together the first draft of the inflection matrix, which was a lot of work, but kind of fun as well, forcing myself to ponder things like, is it cheating to use toroidally as the adverbial form of ring? Why does damn have the superlative damnedest, but not a basic intensifier like damneder? Should the adjectival form of dad be daddy? I tried to keep them all pretty straightforward, but there are some Easter eggs mixed in. The adjectival form of rush? Prog. The noun form of or? Disjunction. The superlative of bit? Byte. In the end, the CSV export of the matrix was 40 kilobytes. Trying to load it onto the Arduino Micro took up, 1960% of its dynamic memory. Even putting it into storage wasn't going to help, even with some basic compression. The Micro was a mistake. This meant a second revision of the control board, to use a Teensy 4.0 instead. Honestly not sure why I didn't use that to begin with. But an easy fix and I could finally assemble the board. The SOIC28 form factor for the MCP23017 chips isn't too small. I used this ancient stereo microscope, originally from Boeing in the 1930s, for doing surface mount work, but I could probably manage with just the magnifying lamp if needed. And someone with younger eyes almost certainly could. I let myself be afraid of surface mount for far too long, and it turns out it's not actually that big of a deal. If you think it would be useful or even just interesting, I really recommend you give it a try. Even just for random amateur projects, the space saving can be really helpful. Unfortunately, when I hooked up the new board, the Teensy couldn't see any of the I2C devices. This left me tearing out my hair for a week while I looked for explanations. First, it turned out I hadn't added pull-up resistors to the I2C data and clock lines. I didn't even know those were required, since my limited I2C experience had only been with integrated products that supply their own pull-ups. This was my first custom I2C implementation using raw chips. A good learning experience, but unfortunately it didn't solve the problem. I then learned a lot more about using a ground plane properly, instead of it just being a convenient way to avoid routing individual traces. I didn't actually think it was an RF issue, but I figured I might as well do it properly while waiting for some more components. When they arrived, I tried assembling another control board, this time only adding a single MCP23017 chip, just to try to eliminate as many variables as possible. It still didn't work, even with the resistors bodged on, even with a filter cap added. Pulling out some more hair, deep in an imposter syndrome panic, I finally noticed something very, very silly. In the schematic, I had routed the SDA line to the SCL pin, and the SCL line to the SDA pin. This probably happened when I updated the schematic from the micro to the Teensy. And once I had assigned those pins to the incorrect SDA and SCL nets, those incorrect labels followed them into the PCB designer view, making it all look hunky-dory from that side of things. God damn it. Time for revision 3. And guess what? I still had something to learn. You need to tie the reset pin on the MCP23017s to high, or else they will randomly reset themselves. So, revision 4. But this time it worked great. Before assembling each board, I ran some test code on it to confirm that the diodes were still good for each switch. Using a pair of tweezers, I'd bridge the holes for each switch, closing the connection, and the code would be running a normal switch matrix scan to tell me when it saw a switch being pressed. It got tedious pretty fast having to look up at the serial output after each one to see if it had been detected. But I already knew there wasn't a good way to have an Arduino beep through the serial port, despite that being the obvious thing to do in this case. Eventually, though, it was so tedious I just couldn't handle it anymore. It can be done, you just have to run a more capable serial client like PuTTY. But terminal beeps are a 1970s technology, 1960s? They're in the ASCII standard, for God's sake. Arduino, why haven't you added support for this in your serial monitor like 15 years ago? Anyway, even with the audible beeps, it was still a lot of work to check all the switches. But it would be much, much harder to replace diodes once the switches were already soldered in. Better to find and fix any problems at this stage. And it's good that I did too, because I probably should have specified larger diodes. Ones this small turned out to be very vulnerable to physical damage. Several had already been broken off, just moving the boards around. There were also a handful that had to be reworked, but I think that's pretty good out of 1,020. That's a failure rate of less than 0.5% for boards I didn't even provide a test jig for. With everything confirmed working on a board, I wanted to get the switches added quickly to physically shield the diodes as best as possible. That meant inserting and soldering 204 switches per board. This was slow, of course, but made far slower by the fact that the switches were free to wiggle a bit in their holes. That hadn't been a problem with the 2/3 because on that one I used an alignment plate, but I didn't want to pay for 5 giant ones to be made this time. So after soldering each switch into place, I had to check to see how out of alignment it was, then heat up one pin at a time from the back while twisting it from the front, repeating until I was satisfied with the alignment. Very slow, very awkward, very imprecise, and moving the boards around that much would certainly result in more broken diodes. Not an acceptable state of affairs. My first thought was to create some kind of jig that would not only hold the switches in the right alignment, but would allow me to hold a bunch of them together to make flipping the boards over for soldering easier too. For reasons I can't explain now, my first thought was to get some Sculpey, push it into a row of aligned switches, then bake it to hold that impression. Of course, the shape got distorted as it was pulled off the switches, and I quickly realized it was an absolutely garbage idea. I also then realized that people had probably faced this problem before. A quick search found some models of rails that could be scaled to be as long as I wanted, and I got a set printing overnight. With these, I could work in sets of 6 switches, or half a row. With 4 rails in use, that was 2 rows at a time. I'd populate those 2 rows with loose switches, then slide the rails over them and flip the board over. There was a small problem with not all of them ending up flush against the board, but it was easy to see which weren't solidly mounted, and push them the rest of the way while heating up their legs from the other side. There was also a couple that still needed their alignment tweaked, but it was at least 10 times faster than what I was managing before. After the switches were added to each board, I did another complete button-by-button test to confirm it was all still working. On Monday, it took me several hours to get just a couple dozen switches installed. But by Thursday, the process had improved to the point that I finished off 2 whole boards that day, with over 400 switches between the two. It was about this time, looking at half a square meter of PCB stretching out to the vanishing point, that I started to think seriously about the physical realities of a keyboard this large. I had been planning to keep it simple by just mounting everything to some plywood left over from the Asteroids arcade cabinet project and call it good. On a project this big, I've come to really fear what I think of as the aesthetics trap. You're working on a project, and the urge strikes you to put in that extra bit of effort to make one part particularly nice. But then, starting on the next part, you realize that you also have to put in that extra effort for it as well, or else the first part will just kind of stand out and look weird by being too much nicer than everything else. It's like the sunk cost fallacy, except it's not a fallacy. The entire project will look nicer if you put in that extra effort. But on a big project, that's not just a rabbit hole to get lost down, it's an entire warren. So I was trying really hard to keep this purely practical, or as practical as a 1000-key keyboard can be anyway. But then I started thinking about what it would be like to drive it down to open source next summer. Because, yeah, of course I want to show it off. And there it is, in the back of the minivan, rattling around, balanced on its side and slamming against the other stuff on every turn. The thing is simply enormous. It could easily destroy itself if not properly contained. So I started looking at cases. I was hoping to find some cool old military crate of some kind, like the one I turned into my big Eurorack case. Striking out on that, I ended up looking at gun cases and then musical keyboard cases. They all topped out at 59 inches when I needed at least 60, and really 65 would be better. It turns out shipping gets very non-linear at that point, so almost all designs stop just short of the dividing line. The only thing I found was this ridiculously overkill case for a 50 caliber rifle. Too large in the other dimensions and far, far too expensive. So I looked into building my own. Turns out there is a wide range of options for custom building road cases, which makes a lot of sense once I thought about it. The parts aren't too expensive, though shipping can be. I needed the full 6-foot lengths of aluminum extrusions, which put it up into that nosebleed category, but it couldn't be helped. I decided to do the case upside down, putting the keyboard in what would normally be considered the lid. This would keep it as close as possible to the desk surface. The other half of the case would need the latches and handles in it, making it at least 6 inches thick, which is way too thick for a keyboard. Assembly is pretty straightforward. You just have to be careful about making all the dimensions match so the corners line up straight with each other. I cut the extrusions to length using a chop saw, since woodworking blades usually work just fine on aluminum. Then I laid out the holes for the rivets and drilled them manually on the drill press, since these were far too long to fit on the mill. The plywood panels were laminated with a protective plastic sheet to give it that classic black road case look. I just used the adhesive spray I had on hand and it worked okay. Some bubbles formed later, but it still looked okay. Barely any of the laminated surfaces will actually be visible once it's set up for display anyway. Assembly was a matter of riveting the extrusions to the plywood panels, and then reinforcing the corners with corner bumpers, also riveted on. I made good use of the pneumatic rivet gun I got for fixing the lid of the cargo bike a while ago. Went through an entire box of 250 rivets by the time the case was done. In addition to the bottom panel of the base, there was also a thicker piece of plywood for the PCBs to actually mount to. I used the PCBs themselves as templates for where the mounting holes had to go. I screwed a threaded insert into each hole, and then screwed a 440 standoff into each one of those. I wanted the standoffs so I wasn't dealing with the irregular spiky backs of the PCBs with all the switch leads poking through. But if I were to do it again, I wouldn't bother. More than a couple sheared off at very normal and reasonable torque levels, and they exaggerated the tilt that the threaded inserts had been screwed in at. Making the top half was much the same, except it had 5 sides instead of 1, and the panels needed holes cut out of them for the latches and handles to mount into. The latches came with these metal backing plates, which also provide a convenient cutting template. Later I realized that while the lid wasn't exactly heavy, it was still big enough to be very cumbersome when being moved by a single person. There were 3 handles on it already, but I had placed those only thinking about lugging the complete keyboard around, not about maneuvering the lid on its own. It was very hard to put back in place without it bumping the keys or the teensy, which I definitely didn't want. So sticking with the road case theme, I bought some of the recessed handles used in the sides of speaker cabinets and mounted them in the top of the panel, a bit less than shoulder width apart. Now I can remove and replace the lid by myself with complete control of all 6 degrees of freedom. Much better. Finally, it was time to attach all 1020 keycaps. In keeping with the theme of the project, this took a while. I'd kept them separated by first letter in their own bags, but that's still quite a few keycaps for certain letters. There are 138 words that start with S alone. I ended up pre-sorting most of the bags onto a cookie tray in the kitchen, alphabetizing them to the second letter there, then bringing them all over and popping them onto the switches. It wasn't unpleasant work, but it did take several hours. Luckily, it wasn't quite so cognitively demanding that I couldn't listen to an audiobook while doing it. It looked pretty great once I was done, but there were still a couple gaps. Some were in a reprints bag that I had missed, but some were actually just missing. Turns out I had just completely skipped feet when getting the die subsheets printed months ago. And instead of break and nod, I had beak and node. So one last round of keycap printing. While I was doing it, I reprinted a couple other keycaps which I wasn't entirely happy with, to use up the rest of my stash. There are still plenty left that I am less than happy with, but I could chase that forever. It's time to get this project done. I've been at it for like 6 months at this point. The code was basically just a scaled up version of what I wrote for the 2/3, but with the support for the inflection matrix added. Unfortunately, a scanning loop that works fine for a 16 by 9 matrix might not work so well for a 17 by 60 matrix. It might, in fact, have a speed reminiscent of a pitch drop experiment. I had been hoping this was just a symptom of the debug prints to the serial line, since serial output can be shockingly slow. But even when running in USB mode, there was still a very noticeable delay between hitting a key and seeing the result, several hundred milliseconds long on average. After trying the normal optimizations without much success, I took a closer look at the Port Expander API and realized there was a way to read in the full I/O state of each chip with a single call. After some careful modifications to the code, and yeah, you really want to be careful when playing with keyboard code, as any mistake that leaves it spamming the output will make it really interesting when you plug it in to fix that problem. But after changing everything over to use read GPIO-AB, the responsiveness went from push down a button and wait half a second to generating multiple events per key press, because you can't push it down and up fast enough. Problem solved. And project complete. Oh, plus I had to make some merch. As always, just because I wanted it for myself. But, you know, feel free to buy it too. After using it on and mostly off for a couple weeks now, I've got to love with you. This isn't a very practical keyboard. I can't even force myself to use it for more than a couple hours for the sake of a bit, like I did with the 2/3, because there's just no way to do real work on this thing. I did have fun running a Q&A on Mastodon one night using just it, though. Usage, mechanical. Find the word you want and press the key. If you want an inflected form, hold down the modifier key first, possibly with the Alt key as well to get the second inflected form for that key. Words are typed lowercase by default, but you can hold down caps to capitalize them, or Alt plus caps to get an all uppercase version. There aren't any arrow keys, but you can navigate by holding down Alt and pushing up, down, left, or right. Some of the other navigation cluster keys work the same way. You're very limited when it comes to numbers, as it only has 1 through 7, 10, and 100. But you can get the numeral versions of the single-digit numbers if you hold down Alt at least. Usage, psychological. It's freaking overwhelming, man. There's so many keys, and yet also somehow not nearly enough. The panels and letter colors do help with finding the word you want, but not enough. It would be better if the panels were narrower, but that just means more panels and more wasted space between them, and an even wider keyboard. It's already stretching my wingspan to press a key on the far left while holding down modifier keys. Figuring out how to say things is a fun challenge, but it's still very limiting. It helps that I had recently been editing the inflection matrix, so at least I had a good idea what words were available. But it still takes some real creativity at times to figure out how to say things. Proper nouns are basically impossible, of course. As far as rating it as a lexicon, I can't say I'd choose all these words myself. Lots of body parts, not many technical concepts. I suppose most people probably do say nose more than node, but I don't think I'm one of them. And without words like tool or device or machine, I end up using thing an awful lot. But it's the incomplete categories like colors and numbers that are particularly frustrating. On the other hand, the curse word selection is enough to make me into a true poet, as Martin Solenis would say. The rest of this computer movie story was written using only the 1,000 words on my new computer letter giving thing. I'm sure I would get faster with time, but I'm not sure how much faster. Not fast enough to be sure. The additional mind work it takes to not only find the words that work to share your ideas, but to find the keys on this field of so many keys is a lot. This is a full-body thing to do. It does kind of feel like you're using some early computer though, or an imaginary mad thinker thing from a bad movie, so that's pretty cool. I did a typing speed checker, using only words that can be typed on the 1,000. On my normal computer letter getter, I managed it with a speed of 7 to 8 tens of words every minute, while on the 1,000 it was only 10 and 3 words every minute. Pretty sad. So that's 6 months of my life, and I'm glad it didn't take any longer, or else I wouldn't even be able to type how long it took. Thanks for sticking around until the end. This was a long and weird one, I know. The next computer movie from me should be on the colored glass things I've been working on. I'm now allowed to use a nearby water cutting thing that should get that finally done soon. And of course, like and sign up to watch. Like and tell the computer you want more. Like and underwrite? Like and you know what I mean. Do the thing.